So you can see here we've entitled this series Mad Hatters, and it's kind of a metaphor for some of the political leaders that we find in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And I think that Samuel does an interesting job, along with the editors that compiled the material, of helping us understand not only these individuals, but really the climate of what often happens in people of power or in people that are seeking power. And that's really going to be true tonight when we talk a little bit about Absalom, the son of David. When you read 1st and 2nd Samuel, this material, by the time we get to David, of course, it begins with the idea of Eli, and we then see Saul come to the throne, and Samuel is from for whom this material's name plays a prominent part in 1st Samuel. But by the time you get to 2nd Samuel, David is the focus, and he has come into focus from really 1st Samuel chapter 15 and after the big fight with Goliath in chapter 17 of 1st Samuel. But when you look at the total perspective of 1st and 2nd Samuel, it's interesting to me how David is depicted. Um, his reign is really presented as a glorious, successful campaign of being king. And all of these are largely based on the memories of these later biblical authors. And what we find is that those who will come later and write 1st and 2nd Kings are going to make the point that David is established as the ruler against whom all other coming kings are going to be judged. So he's the template. And then those who write 1st and 2nd Chronicles kind of whitewash some of the elements of David that are really quite dirty. And we'll see some of that here tonight and how it had an impact upon his son Absalom. So Samuel's authors are kind of being forced, though, because of their close proximity to the events, of giving to us kind of an in time perspective of some of the things that went on around David's ambition. And we said last week that David was the ambitious one. We have looked at several of these individuals that we are using this metaphor, and we've already looked at Eli and Saul and David, and we called David the ambitious king. And today we're going to call Absalom the beautiful rebel. And you'll see why, because he kind of builds momentum on being a people pleaser and using kind of his charisma. Where did he get that from? Well, he got some of that from David. And what we'll find is he will eventually, because of an incident that happens, he will eventually turn on David and become a rebel and try to subvert David's reign. But before we get there, we called Eli the sleepy priest that kind of fell asleep on the job, didn't keep up with what his sons were doing. We called um, Saul kind of the enraged king. He's the one that was impulsive, and he had kind of a paranoia about him. And eventually, this led him to try to kill David and pursue David on several different occasions. We call David the ambitious king because what we find in 1 Samuel 16 and 17, while we tend to glorify those stories as Sunday school worthy, what we find is that there is a lot that's going on there. And the editors of Samuel are trying to give to us a perspective that this is the man that will be the one that will carry on what's going to come later in 2nd Samuel, which we call the Davidic covenant. So today, what I want to do is introduce to you by means of David, a little bit about Absalom, his son. Now, David had 6 sons by 6 different women, and Amnon is his oldest one, and Absalom is his third son, and he has a daughter by the name of Tamar, who is the brother to Absalom. So you kind of keep that in the back of your mind as you see this buildup. So when we come to 2 Samuel chapter 2, here's how it begins. After David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. And David said, to which shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. So David went up there along with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. We'll talk about after our break the character of Nabal. So we'll come back to that. We'll double back and talk a little bit about Nabal as a political figure. And then it says in verse 4, then the people of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And at this point, you have him reigning over the southern tribe of Judah, but not the northern tribes. So you need to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Now, if David wants to be king over the entire territory, he's got a couple of things that he has to deal with. He has to deal with any lingering family members of Saul, and he's going to have to eliminate the household and clear the way. And that involves really 2 targets. One is not a family member, but Saul's general by the name of Abner. He's got to get him out of the way. And the other son's name is Ishbaal. And you can see right there in the name that he is an individual that's named after a foreign god, Baal. And so there's a lot of things that are going on here. Then we come back to the story of David, and we're introduced to a guy by the name of Joab, who is kind of the right-hand man to David. He's also David's nephew. And by the time you get to 2 Samuel chapter 5, there is a portrait now that most of the obstacles that's preventing David from being king over all the tribes have been removed. When you come to chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, it says there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. So there's this transition that is taking place. And by the time you get to chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, and you know we're covering a lot of text here, so we're not looking at all the details and all the verses. But by the time you get to chapter 5, it says this, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, look, we are your bone and flesh. For some time, while Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. In other words, you were the one that brought victory. You were the one that brought security. You're the one that brought prosperity. And so they make a covenant. In verse 3 it says, so all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over all of Israel. And so we're told then how long David will reign in the next verse. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. Now, 7 of those years are in Hebron. 33 of those years is over all the territory. So what's interesting in all this is it's a historical footnote in these verses here, and not much is said from God in the text. God's not mentioned at all in these chapters until you get to chapter 7. And by the time you get to 2 Samuel chapter 7, here's what it says. It says, when the king, verse 1, was settled in his house, and the Lord, we're going to mention the Lord now, had given him rest from all of his enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan, see, I am living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent. And Nathan said to the king, go, do all that you have in mind, for the Lord
is with you. So David has in mind to build a temple. He will be told by the Lord, though, that he is not going to build a temple because he's a man of war. Fascinating, though, in chapter 7 is that God says to David, I will build you a house. Now, it's a play on words here. So he's talking about a physical structure, David, in building a temple. But God, through a covenant, is talking about a dynasty, and the house of David would be on the throne going forward. And so in chapter 7, you have what is called the Davidic covenant. And it kind of comes to a head when it says here in verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. Now keep that in mind because we just mentioned Amnon is the firstborn. We mentioned Absalom being the third-born son of David. Now, the promise is there's going to be this dynasty, and they will follow in their father's footsteps, and they will become kings. But the problem begins with some of the unfolding of what happens during David's reign. And when you begin to kind of fast forward in 2 Samuel, there's all kinds of battles that take place. David's going to go to war with the Ammonites. He's going to confront Armenian mercenaries. He is an individual that continues to prevail. And what we're told in chapter 8 is that sometime afterward, David attacked the Philistines. Now, remember from last week, he had hired himself out as a mercenary to the Philistines. Now he's turning on them because it's politically advantageous for him to do so. And then it says he defeats the Moabites in verse 2. And it goes on and mentions names of different tribes that he conquers. And by the time you get to verse 15 of chapter 8, it says, so David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. Now, keep that in the back of your mind because he really does not do that. What he will do, in light of some of his actions, is deny justice, in particular to Bathsheba's husband and to his own family, because of a salacious story, an event that occurs between Absalom's sister's Tamar, who is raped by the firstborn Amnon. So we'll get to that in a moment. So you fast forward in 2 Samuel, and what we're told is something unfolds in chapter 11, verse 1. It says, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all of Israel with him, and they ravaged the Ammonites, and they besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Now, normally, the king will go out and will be a source of strength for the soldiers out on the battlefield. He stays behind. And it says in verse 2, and you know this story. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, this is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. So this is the adultery that he has with Bathsheba. But more importantly, I think, is this is really a case of rape. She can't say no to the king. So he sends for her and he propositions her and he takes advantage of her. But she's married. She's married to a guy by the name of Uriah. When he finds out that she's pregnant, he's going to try to set Uriah up to take the not I don't want to call the blame, but kind of take the responsibility for her being pregnant. And in verse 6 it says, so David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. And then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. Uriah went down out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. His comrades were on the battlefield. Uriah wasn't going to take advantage of being home. And what David wanted was to have Uriah sleep with Bathsheba and then claim that the pregnancy was Uriah's child. Uriah doesn't cooperate. And now what is David going to do? Well, down in verse 14, it says, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab. Remember, Joab's David's right-hand man, and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And in the letter, he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die. So Uriah is given this letter to deliver um, an information to Joab, and he's carrying his own death sentence. And he hands this letter to Joab, and Joab reads it, and that's what happens. They go out into battle, and they pull back, and Uriah's left out there on an island, and he's killed. In verse 21, it says, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too. Now that comes back to that editorial process. Remember, David, oh, he fought for equity and justice. No, he didn't. He is a murderer. He's a rapist. Now, the text will cover over all this because they will use the phrase David was a man after God's own heart. The editors are doing a job because they want to make sure that the other kings could be as successful as David was because he was winning all the wars. He was a valiant warrior. So now we come to the other story. You know that one, but do you know this one? There's a story about a rape of Tamar, his daughter, by his son Amnon. And this is where Absalom enters into the story. And as you kind of fast forward through the text here, you're going to find in chapter 13 this story that begins with kind of the element of descent. David is going to not be ascending in popularity and that type of thing. Here begins his downfall. And here's how the text goes. Some time passed, David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And David's son Amnon fell in love with her. Amnon was so tormented, so this is half brother, half sister. Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, and the son of David's brother Shimea. And Jonadab was a very crafty man. He said to him, O son of the king, why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me? And Amnon said to him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. So they come up with this scenario that is going to uh, bring about this incident that the rest of the text goes on. And if I can kind of quickly summarize it, he's going to pretend that he's sick and that he wants Tamar to come in and take care of him and give him something to eat. And at that point, Amnon seizes Tamar physically and rapes her. And then we find that Absalom learns of this a little bit later. And you have to hold on to this because he's going to hold anger in his heart for 2 years. And this anger in his heart is going to eventually lead Absalom to kill his half brother Amnon. So that brings us to the introduction to Absalom. So all that David backstory is important. When you come to the text that talks about Absalom, he's introduced, as I've mentioned before, as the king's son, and most of the material about Absalom is found in 2 Samuel 15 through 20. David's oldest son, Amnon, with the encouragement of his friend, rapes his half sister. And what we find is that Absalom's going to hold this in his heart for 2 years. And he's plotting a way that he can get revenge. And so what we find is that when you come to chapter 14, we're told that Joab, uh, it says, perceived the king's mind was on Absalom. And Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman. And he said to her, pretend to be a mourner, put on mourning garments, do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning many days for the dead. Go to the king and speak to him as follows. And Joab put words into her mouth. So this now focuses on David's reaction to Absalom killing Amnon. So how it was Amnon killed? Well, he got drunk, and what we find is that when he was drunk, Absalom, who has his own servants as the king's son, he tells them to kill him, and they do so. But it's at Absalom's command. Word gets back to David about this. And in chapter 14, we find Joab is trying to come up with a scenario to kind of squash the ongoing division that's going to be continuing to get stronger and stronger between David and Absalom. David has not taken care of his own home. Absalom's now going to resist David. And as Absalom resists, what we find taking place is everything's coming to a head. And as it comes to a head, David has already lost his firstborn, Amnon. Is he going to have to kill his thirdborn, Absalom? Well, Absalom flees as word gets back to David, and he goes into hiding and into exile. And Joab conspires with this wise woman to try to get Absalom and David to reconcile. And that's really all of chapter 14. It's pretty lengthy. But Absalom is in a foreign land trying to avoid the consequences of murder. And it raises to a head. And Absalom, though, while he is in exile, is building his rapport as an outstanding leader. He's politicking because he is declaring it. Where is he going to declare to be king? We are told that he's going to declare himself to be king in Hebron. Isn't that what David did earlier? He declared himself to be king in Hebron. And what we find is now he's going to raise a resistance against David. And under the advice of Ahithophel, David's former advisor, we're going to find that Absalom is going to desecrate the household of David by raping some of the women in David's harem. When David realizes that Absalom is going to try to overthrow his rule, David then goes on the run. And he's going to flee from Absalom's army. And he leaves behind some spies in the city. And he leaves behind these 10 concubines. Well, when Absalom gets to the city, what we are told is that he is an individual that rapes these 10 concubines out in public.
And in doing that, he is shaming David's rule and he's positioning himself to be the new king. Now, here is the power of Absalom. And the reason I call him a beautiful rebel is found in chapter 14, verse 25. The editors say, "Now in all Israel there was no one to be praised so much for his beauty as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him." He's the perfect specimen. Isn't that what happened with Saul? Remember, he was chosen to be king because he had the physical uh, 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 qualities that people had confidence and that type of thing. Verse 28 says, "So Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence." So he lives in Jerusalem for a while. David won't see him because of what he did in killing his oldest son. And we're told now, as the text moves forward, that Absalom has enough people to lead a coup against David. And so the narrator, in talking about how beautiful he is bringing back all of these things from earlier information that Absalom probably will be a better ruler than David is. David is not doing some things that he should be doing, and he is doing some things that he shouldn't be doing. And Absalom, like his father, has ambitions to take over the throne. And he's willing to kill, just like David was, for the position. So by the time you get to chapter 15, Absalom's going to lead this coup. It says in verse 1, "After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him." Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the road in the gate. And when anyone brought a suit before the king for judgment, Absalom would call out and say, "From what city are you?" And when the person said, "Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel," Absalom would say, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no one deputed by the king to hear you." Here, he doesn't care about what's happening in his kingdom. He won't even hear the cases that the people are bringing to him. But Absalom is. And as Absalom listens, and as he tries to understand the injustice that is going on among the tribes, what we find is verse 6. It says, "Absalom did to every Israelite who came to the king for judgment." Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. He won over the populace because he was willing to listen. And this builds up his reputation among the people. And then he begins this coup. He puts it into practice. Verse 10 says, "Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, 'As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then shout, Absalom has become king at Hebron.' 200 men from Jerusalem went with Absalom." And so you get the picture. There's an overthrow that's taking place here. So this is now 4 years later from the time that Amnon raped Tamar, and a lot of things have been going on. But as Absalom's armies come rolling into Jerusalem, um, what we find taking place is there are still some people loyal to David, and now there's many more that are loyal to Absalom. And the raping of the 10 concubines now secures in the eyes of the people that Absalom and David are arch enemies. Now, there's a little bit of poetic justice that's going on in the text. David is guilty of rape in private, Bathsheba. David's concubines are raped in public by Absalom. So, in all of this, what we see taking place is the overthrow. Now, what we find is the people that are loyal to David, in particular Joab, his right hand man, knows you got to get rid of Absalom. There's no doubt about it. All the people's hearts have gone over to Absalom. And so what he does is he is the one that is willing to take Absalom out. And by the time you get to chapter 16, verse 15, it says, Now Absalom and all the Israelites came to Jerusalem. Ahithophel was with him. And when Hushai, the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, Hushai said to Absalom, Long live the king, long live the king. And Absalom said to Hushai, Is this your loyalty to your friend? Why do you not go with your friend? Hushai said to Absalom, No, but the one whom the Lord and the people and all the Israelites have chosen, his I will be, and with him I shall remain. So he switched sides, supposedly. Now, Absalom's going to say to Ahithophel, Give us your counsel. What shall we do? Ahithophel said to Absalom, Go into your father's concubines, the ones he has left to look after your house, and rape them. So there's a lot of material that's going on. And then Ahithophel says, beginning in chapter 17 of 2 Samuel, he says to Absalom, Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will set out and pursue David tonight. That's a lot of soldiers. 12,000? This is hyperbole. Okay? This is not an accurate count. There's no way there's 12,000. But what we find is that there is advice. Hushai says to Absalom, This time the counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good. Hushai continued, You know that your father and his men are warriors, and they are enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father is an expert in war. He will not spend the night with the troops. In other words, you're going to get killed. They're better soldiers than you are. They go to battle, and David wins the battle against Absalom's army. But what we see taking place is this. Absalom's going to try to escape. Now, David has already said to Joab to be gentle on Absalom. He doesn't want him to kill Absalom. But Joab's not going to show any mercy. And here's where Absalom's beauty comes into play in the story. David's story is one of retreat from his son. At least initially, he flees. And finally, he has to go to war with his sons. And what we find is that Absalom, we're told, is going to be killed. And here's how he is killed. He's going to try to escape on his ride, and because of his long hair, he rides under this tree, and his hair gets caught in the branches, and the animal continues on out from under him, and he's left hanging there in the branches with his hair. And what we find is that then Joab comes along, and we're told in verse 14, Joab says, I will not waste my time with you, speaking to Absalom. He took 3 spears in his hand, thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak tree. So what we see taking place is now Absalom has been killed. The threat has been removed from David's reign. David will be able to continue his reign over all the tribes. However, the way David responds brings great discouragement to Joab and some of his other soldiers, because chapter 19 says the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And we're told in chapter 18, verse 33 through 19:2, that he's inconsolable. And the morale of David's army sinks because they've been out there fighting Absalom's army, and he's more concerned about the loss of his son, Absalom. And verse 4, chapter 19 says, The king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Then Joab came into the house of the king and said, Today you have covered with shame the faces of all your officers
who have saved your life today, and the lives of your sons and daughters, and the lives of your wives and concubines, for the love of those who hate you, and for the hatred of those who love you. Wow, that's quite a line. For the love of those who hate you, Absalom and his army, for the hatred of those who love you, me, and your family, and your servants. So the story of Absalom is kind of like the walnut inside the shell of David. And you have to kind of crack open David a little bit to get to Absalom. But if we could analyze Absalom for a few moments, here's how I would summarize it. His exterior, he was a handsome individual. He's charismatic. He had this presence about him, and it is symbolized in this long hair, and it's a symbol of his allure. And so he's able to win the people over first by image, and he understands optics. He understands what it is to play to the propaganda through his looks. Secondly, if you take a look at inside of Absalom's heart, he's wounded because of the rape of his sister Tamar. His dad doesn't do anything about it. He smolders in anger and rage for a couple of years, and finally he decides he's going to kill his brother Amnon. He becomes the estranged son. He goes into exile. After he kills Amnon, he flees to a place called Geshur. He lives there for 3 years. Finally, when David allows him to come back into Jerusalem, David does not go to see him. He refuses to see him. So there's no reconciliation that takes place. There's no restoration. There's no healing. This continues to weigh on Absalom. His heart is getting harder and harder because David has not forgiven him. David has only kind of half forgiven him by allowing him to come back to the palace area. That brings us to Absalom's politics. He steals the people's heart because he positions himself at the gate. He's willing to listen. He affirms their grievances under David's reign. He promises that they'll have a better system. Does this sound familiar? This is Politics 101, right? This is what happens after every campaign cycle. Absalom succeeds where David is distant, and he weaponizes the empathy he shows by leading an army against David. His rule is power, but he doesn't have wisdom. Makes some foolish decisions. He does not try to seek a peace treaty with his dad. He wants the throne, and he's going to seize it as quickly as he can. And then his death. It's kind of a trap of his own making. He's in battle, but he's not wearing a helmet. He's allowing his hair to flow, and as he rides, it gets caught in the tree. And this is a haunting image. He's hanging there. And as he's hanging there, he is suspended, unable to move, and Joab kills him, even though David gave explicit orders not to do that. So David kind of is then overwhelmed by the loss of his son. And then Joab is saying, don't you realize Absalom wanted to take your throne? And what do? Just like David did with Saul. Get rid of the competition. Get rid of the threat. Get rid of the relatives. Get rid of the servants. Get rid of the army. Get rid of all those that could possibly turn on you. So the symbol of Absalom's pride becomes kind of a mechanism of his own undoing. And what we find is at the end of it, David will come back, and by the time you get to 2 Samuel chapter 20 and following,
The story has moved back off of Absalom, and now it's moved back onto David. However, there is another story within another walnut, and it's the story of Joab, his right hand man. And there's a lot of text that is given about Joab and his politics and his maneuvering and his manipulating of David. And that's the next character we'll look at when we come back from break. So here's kind of the way I'd like to summarize Absalom. He steals the people's hearts. He is able to present a beautiful image. He hears the people's grievances. He makes things as part of a public spectacle. He rejects wise counsel of people that are more experienced than he is, and he will die by his own strength to be able to manipulate other people. So there is a modern parallel. You'll see this in politics, you'll see this in politicians all the time. The populism by emotional appeal. Usually there's some type of celebrity branding of politicians. There is something revolutionary that a politician is saying that people are clamoring for because people are frustrated that their leaders do not really care for them. And of course, in our day and age, the way the propaganda works is through the media driven politics. There is no news stations that are absolutely pure, unprejudiced. You have to remember that when you watch the news. They're always coming from an angle of some sort. Um, in politics today, you have a ton of echo chambers that all say the same thing. There's not a lot of wisdom. There's not a lot of difficult thinking about how to handle and change some of the problems that we're under. And then ultimately, our politicians put themselves where they eventually self destruct. They put themselves in a position where they're really only pursuing power and money. And eventually, this is going to come back and get them because there's always somebody that has better branding, always somebody that has a better idea, always somebody that has a better way of using the media to their own strength. And eventually, it's self destructive. I wish things could be different, but that's what you got. Absalom and the modern figures of our own day. You have all these leaders that kind of just are parallels to David, to Absalom, and next time we're together, we'll talk about Joab, and then we'll begin to wind this down. But you can see as you read First and Second Samuel, this is not ancient text as much as it is an ongoing text. It is something that happens in every generation, and we have to keep our eyes open for it and understand that there's a lot of similar patterns that happen, whether these are people that lived 3,000 years ago or people that are living in our own day and age. And hopefully it helps us to have a little bit better wisdom in knowing how to understand what they're feeding to the public. So let me stop our recording